All right, all. So week 6, we made it. Thank you, everyone who's back again. Um, I don't know if you saw, but NBC News aired a segment with Marty and one of the attendees of the series today, just to get a little bit more coverage on it. So keep an eye out for it. It's pretty cool that we got some extra press. You're going to be receiving follow-up surveys in the mail from Kelly. Please, as we mentioned each session, this was geared to help give you a roadmap of things to consider when you're starting your company. So let us know what we can do better if we're going to put it on again in the future. Please be honest. We have thick skin, and that's the only way we can really make this better for you guys if we put it on again. Kelly's also going to follow up with a link to all of the presentations and PowerPoints. If there's one that you don't have or you couldn't make, you'll get it. And if you need anything else, just follow up with any of us and let us know. The session tonight is also going to be recorded like it was last time. So if you have any concerns about being on our website or don't want to ask questions, just ask questions afterwards. Everything that you say on here, is going to wind up on our website and being recorded. So just a heads up. Is there anyone who's been to all 6 of the sessions? I see a few faces who I think raise your hand. We have some special swag for you, so come find me afterwards. And for those of you who didn't make all 6, we have some stuff too. I want to recognize 2 people who really put this together. Kelly and Dave, if you can please stand up in the back. They did the lion's share of what you really don't see, kind of the logistics and the food and the emails and everything. And so we got them a thank you gift from one of our veteran clients, Bullets to Bandages. If you guys haven't checked them out, you should. They make 50 caliber bottle openers. They have a custom engraver as well, so they can put your names, or my wife was pissed when I got my 3-year-old one of these as well. But it's a pretty cool company. You should check them out. A bunch of their proceeds go to veterans as well. So Dave and Kelly, thank you guys so much for putting this together. So government contracting. Tonight we have Mike Kurgan and Jonathan Kane. Mike is the CEO and founder of Service Wing Healthcare. His company has a deep commitment to veterans, and he has been on both the up and down side of government contracting. So he can let you know some of the pitfalls. Make sure that you ask him questions. He's a client of Mintz's, and he's really seen everything from the inside out. And Jonathan Kane has flown out from Washington, D.C. to be here with you tonight. He is the guy for all of the government contracting related issues that we refer any of our clients to throughout the country. So he has a wealth of knowledge dealing with these issues. And again, take advantage of having these guys on the panel tonight. So, gentlemen.
Thanks, Justin. Mike and I thought the way we would handle this tonight is I'd just take a few minutes at the beginning and we'd go through a little briefing about how some of the principal issues in federal procurement and in qualifying as a veteran-owned small business or as a service-disabled veteran-owned small business. A few of the things that are unique about being a federal contractor as opposed to running a commercial business, some of the special issues that relate to intellectual property and patents and data rights and software, and then some of the compliance issues. And I'll try to very high level sort of briefing about this. And then Mike is going to spend a few minutes talking about from the company side, some of the, as Justin said, the highlights and pitfalls of dealing with at least one major federal agency with a very innovative product that his company had developed and is in the process of marketing to the Veterans Administration. And then we will open it up to questions, and we hope we will have a pretty engaged discussion. And that's really the part that I think he and I both find most interesting. So we hope that you won't feel at least a bit shy about asking those questions. So initially, let's see here if I get this right. Just quickly, I'm going to talk about some of these qualification issues and with that, as I mentioned earlier. So there are 2 kinds of veteran-owned small businesses. The first is what's called a veteran-owned small business. It is a program that is for the Veterans Administration only. You need not be disabled. You need to be a vet, and you have to register for qualification You have to meet qualification standards and go through a registration process to be put on the VA's database, vendor information pages database. And once you're on that database, they will direct their contracting efforts in your direction, at least in the first instance. This only applies to VA contracts. It doesn't apply to contracts in any other federal agency. And the reason for that is that you need only be a vet. You don't need to be disabled. And the government-wide programs, the focus is on service-disabled vets. And so the range of opportunities if you're service-disabled is much broader. But nevertheless, if you are a non-disabled vet, there is still this program available at the VA. There are some qualification criteria, which I've listed there. Essentially, you have to be your company has to be 51% owned unconditionally and directly by one or more veterans. All the profits, 51% of the distributions have to come to those owners, and the veterans have to be in daily management control of the company. And there is as I said, there's a certification process you go through at the VA. You fill out a bunch of forms online. You wait weeks, months for them to respond. They will have concerns about the way your corporate documents look, perhaps, if there's something not quite right. You file an appeal. It's supposed to be decided in 60 days, maybe 6 months, maybe a year later you'll get an answer. It is a very heavily bureaucratic, weighed down with bureaucratic rules program. It's not very user-friendly, unfortunately. A much more friendly program to service-disabled veterans is available from the Small Business Administration. This program applies government-wide. Every federal agency will recognize and set aside contracts for service-disabled vets. And in order to qualify for it, you have to have proof of your service disability. As we said before, 51% of the stock has to be owned by one or more service-disabled vets. The daily business operations management of the company has to be in the hands of the service-disabled vets. And you have to be a small business under the SBA size standards. And those size standards are varied depending on whatever your NAICS code is. It's the code number that describes the business that you are in. And so if you're a software developer, you have one code. If you're the manufacturer of pencils, you have another code. And those codes, they set the threshold beneath which you are small, above which you are large, and you don't qualify. The great thing about this program is if you meet the standards, you meet the qualification criteria, you self-certify in your offer in response to a solicitation. You check the box, yes, I'm a service-disabled veteran company, and you sign the form, and that's the end of it, unless somebody challenges it.
The control piece, it doesn't have a real firm boundary on what that means. But what does it mean to have board control and management of daily business operations?
Board control means that service-disabled vets sit in 51% of the seats on the board. They control the board, okay? And the daily management control means that they are the highest executive officer and that they have practical daily management authority and function in the company. You can't have a nominal chief executive officer and a non-service disabled vet's actually running the business.
Okay, so one of the criteria is if he's only one, he needs to be the leading controlling entity in the company.
Correct.
CEO.
Correct. Okay.
Are either one of those phrases, VOSB or veteran-owned small business or service-disabled veterans small business, are those registered names? Is that something you could use even if you weren't registered? In other words, a veteran-owned small business is a veteran-owned small business, whether it's registered with VA or not.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, no, the government can't establish a copyright on those,
right.
Or a trademark on those words. But if you go to the government and you say, or to a prime contractor, and you say, I'm a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, and you're not, I mean, it's, you know.
No, but if you were a veteran-owned
misrepresentation.
small business and you just did it in your advertising, that would be illegal.
I think it depends exactly on how you're using it and exactly, if you qualify, if you meet the
No, if you
criteria,
qualify. If you
yeah,
qualify,
then
then
yes,
I'll
then
register.
fine, then it's fine, yes, yeah, sure. In fact, people do,
That's what I'm thinking.
yeah, they do. They advertise that way. Okay. Okay, so why would you go through this process of being either a service-disabled, veteran-owned business or otherwise? The first is that if you're on the VOSB database, the VA database, as I said, there are contracts that are set aside for companies that are on that database, VA contracts, and they may be national contracts, may be regional, they may be hospital by hospital. Okay? Under the SBA program, the Service Disabled program, there are also set-asides. And for prime contracts, in other words, contracts directly between yourself and the government agency, if they are over $3,000, but under $150,000 in value, then the government, and there are at least 2 service-disabled veteran companies that are likely to make an offer. The agency does market research, and they determine there's at least 2 potential offerers. They're required to set it aside for those small businesses, okay? And they can actually, at the end of the competition, if only one offers, there were at least 2 bidding who were qualified to bid that were reasonably expected to bid based on market research, but only one made an offer, they can award the contract as a sole source, provided that it doesn't exceed $3 million if it's a service contract or $5.5 million if it's a manufacturing contract. Okay? In addition, and frankly, the more valuable piece of all this is that prime contractors have subcontracting quotas. Every large business that gets federal business has to have a small business subcontracting plan as part of their contract. And they are looking for qualified small businesses, women-owned small businesses, service-disabled veteran small businesses, et cetera. And so if you meet those criteria, if you're a genuine, legitimate service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, it ups your likelihood of getting a subcontract over somebody who's not, because they have to meet, those large businesses have to meet that quota. That's where, for the most part, that's where the real benefit is. If you are going to take advantage of these things, there are some limitations. You can't be a sort of this can't be a sham. So if you are going to take advantage of the criteria, you have to perform, as I laid it out here. Basically it's 50% of the labor cost of a contract has to come from your own employees. You can't just be the nominal contractor and subcontract all the work to somebody else. Okay, and if it's construction, there's different, and for procurement of goods, I mean, the rules are slightly different depending whether it's a service, construction, or goods contract. But essentially, there's a limitation on how much you can subcontract out, and I've set it out there. I want to talk just a couple minutes here about how the federal government works as an agency, and this will relate to something that Mike's going to talk about a little bit later. Unlike a lot of businesses, commercial businesses, the government has a very organized way, and some of you may have confronted this or worked within it in your own professional careers in the military, but the fact is that unlike a lot of commercial businesses, the government has there's a bright line between people who run programs and people who can bind the government by contracting officers. And so there are going to be 3 or 4 different groups of people you're going to confront. One is the contracting officer. That's the person who has the legal authority to sign documents and bind the government. And it's the only person who can bind the government. A program manager, a support contractor, somebody you're working with in the field, none of those people have the authority to bind the government. This becomes important because during the course of contract performance, you may find that somebody comes to you and says, hey, this was great. Can you change it to do that? And you say, sure, it might cost us a little more, and they say, fine, just go ahead and do it. I'll take care of it. I'll make sure you're all right. It ain't going to happen that way, right? Because only the contracting officer has the authority to make any changes in that contract, and it has to be done in writing.
But it all depends on the contract.
I beg your pardon?
It all depends on the contract, like
No.
price, and they have, what's another term that they use where,
Okay.
the different contract.
I mean, really, it makes it, the rule, the firm hard rule is only a federal contracting officer has the authority to bind the government, and anything else you get from anybody else isn't worth the paper it's written on or the words that, the handshake that you're given. It's the way it is. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is that every contracting officer before they issue a contract is required to do what's called a past performance evaluation. And they are required to go look to see how you have done in other contracts with the federal government or with commercial parties. And if it's the first time you've done a federal contract, or if it's a contract for so-called commercial items, which is something that you might sell in the open market as well as to a federal agency, they will want to hear from, you'll have to supply them with basically commercial references. How have you done? Okay. Have you been on schedule? Did your product meet the requirements? Were you easy to work with as a supplier? Did you give them a hard time? Lots of questions like that. And they're required to evaluate that. So, and you get a chance to see what those past performance evaluations are. If somebody else does, the contracting officer is going to write one up and put it in the file. You're entitled to see it. They're supposed to send it to you. You have 30 days to send in. If you've got your side of the story, you think the contracting officer's been unfair, you need to respond. Okay? Because that also goes in the file, and otherwise only the bad side of the story gets kept.
Sorry, so you were saying with the products you would get references, but what about for services?
Same thing.
Same thing, with just references for type of work that you've done.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. I want to spend a little bit on IP rights here because for those of you who are maybe doing software or some information systems kind of things, there are the rules of engagement with the government versus the commercial world are very different. In the government, they recognize two kinds of intellectual property. One's called patents, which you heard some in, I think, session 2, we had a discussion about patents. And the other one is called data rights. And the federal data rights includes both information, like drawings, designs, text, things you write up, and the other one is software. And the important thing to know about federal data rights is that if the government pays for the development of a piece of data, whether it be software or information, the government will end up with rights to it. They may be unlimited rights, which means they can distribute it throughout the world to whomever they choose, okay, without compensating you further. It may be what's called government purpose rights, which means that the government can use it within the government for a period of time, distribute it to other government agencies or to federal agency contractors to use for government purposes, okay? Or it may be what's called limited or restricted rights, which are akin to sort of commercial copyright rights. In other words, the government cannot distribute it beyond the agency that bought it, all right? Which one of those categories your data rights fall into depends upon whether or not the government paid for all the development, part of the development, or none of it, okay? You can sell something that you have developed to the government, something you've developed using your own money, okay? And you can claim that it's restricted rights, right? If the government helps you develop it, they fund part of it, then the government, if it's a defense agency, will get it under what's called government rights, government purpose rights. If the government pays for the whole thing, they get unlimited rights, which means essentially you've essentially done, sort of contract software development for the government. And you still have the right to use it, but they have the right to distribute it, reproduce it, distribute it to whoever they please. I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on it. It's a very complicated area, but what I have done is in the materials you have, I have given you this summary. It's 2 pages basically of these table that will help you kind of figure out where you are and what rights are associated with each of those categories, right? It's important to understand it if you're going to be in this business and if you're going to respond to federal solicitations that involve software or data. Just briefly about sort of how you deal with these issues of, how is it that companies use federal money to leverage their private investment in data or software development. It can be done. It's done all the time. But you have to be very thoughtful about how it's done. And one of the ways you do it is you start at the beginning before you take your first federal dollar, and you lay out a strategy about who's going to pay for specific pieces of the development of your product. Okay? You have to have a strategy thought out. You probably want to consult with somebody who's been through it before to figure out how you're going to divide up the work effort and keep them separate, keep them in their own silos, so at the end of the day, you can prove, if you need to, that this piece of work was paid for with my private funds, and therefore, government, you don't get any rights except those I grant you. And this work was paid for by the government, you get all the rights, but you know what? I don't care because it doesn't work without the piece I paid for myself. Okay? That's the whole game. And companies do it all the time, but you have to understand that that's the game, and you have to sort of be thoughtful about it at the beginning so that you've allocated where you're going to spend your money and in what pieces you're going to spend it on. Okay? I'll get back. Okay. More generally, as a federal contractor, there are a lot of things you have to do that probably are not sort of the things that a general commercial business would have to worry about. You have to have an ethics code. You have to, have a company policy and a plan to detect and deter non-compliance with rules, fraud, misconduct, criminal activity, et cetera. You've got to have a plan, and you've got to have it in writing. Okay? There are certain things you can do in the commercial world when it comes to sales you can't do when you're dealing with the government. You can't give gratuities. You can't take people on golf trips. Okay? You can't take them to dinner. There are restrictions on kickbacks from subcontractors. You can't give your subcontractor, have you rebate some of the money you pay to them as a concession for choosing subcontractor A over subcontractor B. There are rules and laws against colluding with your fellow vendors to to divide up the market or to collude in bidding. Okay, very severe penalties for that. And there are restrictions on spending money lobbying, and lobbying is not only your congressman, it's also federal executive branch employees. Okay? There are equal opportunity and affirmative action requirements. You're going to have to file forms with the federal government every year. You're going to have a plan for hiring a certain number of qualified minorities, women, et cetera. Okay? There are certain products are subject to what's called the Buy America Act and the Trade Agreements Act. That means that you may not be able to supply, for example, a video camera made in Singapore that you might otherwise want to supply because it's less expensive than one made in the United States. Okay? You may not be able to. Now, the one area where there is actually a fair amount of flexibility has to do with computers, basically. But trade agreements and Buy America is a significant restriction. And if you're going to be using foreign-made end products, that doesn't mean the component parts of a product, but foreign-made end products, you need to do need to think about and have someone help you get through an analysis as to whether or not your product will actually qualify before you offer it. Okay. I'll just mention there are rules against making false claims to the government. What a surprise. And there are requirements that you have programs and procedures in place to prevent retaliation against people who report misconduct to the government that your company might be engaged in. When you set out to do a piece of federal business for the first time, you can't even make an offer until you have registered in what's called the System for Award Management, SAM. It is sort of a combination of your business information, your Dun & Bradstreet data, your reps and certs about who you are and what your status as a business is. It's a fairly extensive set of data that you have to plug into a set of online forms. You will have to make reports annually, for EEO on these EEO1 and VETS 100 forms, which are how many minorities have you hired, how many vets have you hired. There are special rules for posting. You go around to businesses, obviously, you see these posters that say, minimum wage in California is X. If you're a federal contractor, there are additional things that you're required to have posted in your place of business. And then finally, just a word about records retention, because people never really know what that means or how long they have to keep things. This is a pretty simplified, but it's safe. Okay. You have to keep all records related to a specific contract for 3 years after you receive final payment and contract closeout. That's not the last deliverable, but it's the last when the contract is actually formally closed out. And you have to keep, my recommendation is you keep everything related to a contract for 6 years, because that's the statute of limitations on the False Claims Act. And you may want those documents in case somebody comes to you later. Okay? So as I said, Mike's been through this drill at the VA. And I'm just going to ask if he would take a few minutes and talk about both Service Wing, its business and its products, and how you developed it, and then a little bit about the experience you've had in dealing with that specific agency.
Thank you. So Service Wing Healthcare is a company that specializes in software that we take healthcare data from multiple sources, compile it, and bring the data into the clinical workflow. And it's a very broad platform. We can use it in congestive heart failure patients, chronic diseases, but in the VA we actually did something fairly unique and looked at mental health. And what we did there was, as a veteran walked into the VA, they would be given a questionnaire testing for TBI, PTSD, suicide, military sexual trauma. The battery of questions was roughly about 200 questions. Now anybody can create a survey monkey, if you will, but this questionnaire was on paper. Now in dealing with the VA, you have to, or DOD, you have to meet certain requirements for the computer software and making sure it's hardened, that you're dealing with personal identifiable information, PII. So we were able to do that, but not only do the automatic scoring, we were able to actually generate a clinical note and report it to the VA system, which is Vista, or Clinical Reminder, or actually even set up an appointment. If a veteran showed positive signs for TBI, the VA is supposed to start a treatment program within 24 hours of detection. Prior to our system going in San Diego, the average wait time was 14 days for these evaluations to be fulfilled. Obviously, we're doing it immediately. We have almost day one, we had a veteran walk in, score positive for TBI, we set up an appointment same day. By 3 o'clock, he's already seen his neurologist and started a counseling session for that. So, very dramatic efficiency that we saw there. We had great support from the clinicians, from a VISN director, the VISN CIO, and it's a program that should continue. So that's the good story about the VA, and that we had such a good supporting cast of stakeholders involved in that. Now, that being said, and I don't want a few of the things that Jonathan sort of mentioned to you is you'll have to decide, do you want to be a prime or a sub? And there's a lot of, being a prime is a lot harder, and that's in the case of Service Wing, that's what we were. When you have especially a designation, it's very, the prime contractors are out there, and they're, specifically as what Jonathan said, they are looking for subcontractors to fill those quotas. So that's always a good position to be in. What we had happen, and even after a very successful implementation of the program, we had letters of support from the VISN director, and there's a little over 20 of them. They report to the Undersecretary of the Health, who reports to the Secretary, who reports to the President. So you're pretty close in the food chain when you have a VISN director supporting your project. We also had supports from the clinicians, and we had not our documents, but we had documents from the clinicians documenting the improvements. Then it goes into the contracting department. And with that, even the program manager, again, going back to what Jonathan was saying, they don't have the final authority to actually contract. And then it goes into the contracting office. The good thing, I would say the most positive thing as a proving ground, if you can do it in the VA, you can do it anywhere. So that's, and if you can't, it doesn't mean you have a bad business model. It just means you need to work a little bit harder. But what we've experienced, and this isn't a commercial for Mintz Levin, but we actually, as a partner negotiating the contract, we are able to assert certain rights even after the proof of concept. And the things that we're looking at are those IP rights. It was very interesting when we were at the final stage of contracting, and these are sometimes get very date sensitive. We signed our contract September 27th. If it wouldn't have gone past September 30th, the appropriation would have been lost. We would have had to start all over again. So that September 30th date becomes a very hard number, and you'll see things delayed, and then a plethora of contracts are released towards the end. I have investors in my company. I had one investor saying, don't worry about the IP rights, just sign the contract. We don't want to lose this contract. We fought, Jonathan actually had a right opinion to the contracting officer why Service Wing was entitled to keep its IP rights. And we actually, in our contract, received the Alt-4 provision, which gives the government very limited rights, and we showed that we had existing IP. If we didn't have that today, we wouldn't have a chance to stay in the expansion mode. So I think and I've written contracts most of my life, and I can tell you I would have gotten lost on this one without the support of Mintz Levin. So that's very, especially in the IP side. As you were mentioning, there's certain terms of the contract that seems like you have a little latitude, but there really isn't. You have what sometimes is called a COTAR. In our case, that's the contracting officer's technical representative, and he's not able to bind the company or the government to any contracts. And they actually send a letter saying even though he's the technical representative of the contracting officer, he has no authority to alter or bind the contract.
Even if the contract is level of effort?
Well, if it's a level of effort and it's in the contract that you can do it, then the contract speaks for the contract. but there is nothing. I mean, and sometimes you're going to have to make a business decision. There was a component that our supporter, the lead clinician in San Diego, needed a component. It was completely out of scope. Everybody agreed it was completely out of scope. And she said, Mike, it won't be effective. And we could not get a change order. And I made the decision. We were going to do the change for the benefit of our client and the veterans, and we never got compensated from it. And we actually had support from the program office saying, we will take care of this at the right appropriate time. Never happened. There's no truer words that were spoken with Jonathan. If it's not written in the contract and somebody promises you payment later, it will not occur. And it doesn't mean there's not good people trying to do it, wanting to do the right thing, but as a business, you're going to have to make those calls. And quite honestly, I would have done the same thing over, even knowing that we weren't going to get paid, because we would have actually had a less effective system that wouldn't have produced the results that we want for our veterans. So you're going to find those pitfalls. So that's sort of like, in going through the contracting process, I've dealt with some really good contracting officers, and I've dealt with some really bad ones. And when we got our first contract approved, I actually sent an email out to everybody saying, you were very professional, thank you. And I actually got a reply from that person's boss saying, we never see those type of emails. And it wasn't that the person gave us everything we wanted. It was just very concise. It was very professional. When we had a disagreement or an issue that needed to be resolved, he would escalate it to the right person, get the legal opinion, specifically in this case with who would own the IP. He listened to what Jonathan had to say, took it to his legal team, came back and turned it around, and we got that favorable component. I've dealt with others that won't listen to you at all, won't return your phone call, and that's just the way the bureaucracy works. So I guess from my experience, I'm grateful, that the opportunity that we've had working with the government. I think it's interesting. If I knew what I know today, would I have done it? I don't know. But probably that was part of the blessing, is I didn't know. But even as we take our software and put it in the commercial marketplace, the very fact that we've proven it in the most archaic system, and even the people at the VA would acknowledge that the VISTA system is a very old, archaic system, and that we were able to integrate into that system and show these results so quickly in a period of performance that we had this up and running in less than 6 months is a very, I can sell it to anywhere in the world. Nobody else is going to be able to take that claim away from us. We're very positive about being able to expand it. We see, the effect that it had on veterans, but it does take a village. In lobbying, that's something you should take and consider. You cannot take any federal dollars and move that into a lobbying account. So if you have private money or you're raising funds, keep that in a separate account, never commingle. And it's probably a good idea just to keep your government funds in one checking account and any other funds in another account, so you have a pretty good wall. But and lobbying isn't you as the executive going talking to your members of Congress. That's not a lobbying. It's if you hired a paid lobbyist. But we've been very fortunate to get our message up on the Hill. I've been able to meet with Barry Sanders, chairman of the VA committee, on the Senate side. We've gotten some local Democrat and Republicans in Southern California that are aware, and their voices help too. So I'll open it up to questions. And
Have you encountered protests, like you were gonna get the contract and then all of a sudden some companies protested?
We actually, we have not experienced that.
Because in DOD, that's common. When I was working at Power, I was not involved in the contracting, I was involved in writing the tech specs.
Mm-hmm.
And every time we selected the company, hey, here you go, someone submitted a protest.
Protests they come in several different flavors. There are about 3,000 protests were filed against federal procurement decisions last year. Out of those 3,000, 15 to 18% were resolved in favor of the protester. Okay? The vast majority were either dismissed out of hand, or they were decided in favor of the government, or they were settled. Okay? And settled usually means the government says, well, we'll look at it again, or something like that. Look at the decision again. There are more protests being done today than there were a couple years ago because people are just filing them hoping that they'll get something. Maybe the winner will try to cut a deal, give them a piece of the contract if they'll go away. But protests are a fact of life. I've made a good living doing protests, but the success ratio is not high. The hurdles to the protester are pretty steep. You have to really know that you've gotten a good solid grounds to do it, or it's not really worth the angst.
And I would add to that is the government are now creating contract vehicles that are anti-protesting. In the VA, there's a technical program called T4, and it was a $12 billion contract awarded to 14 vendors and allowing only one set of protests, thus allowing, once that was settled, task orders can be drawn down from that. So it doesn't actually go through you'll see procurement process anymore. It's a $12 billion fund. They just issue a task order. There is no opportunity to protest from anybody on that one. Because once the protests were settled in the 12 or the 14 companies, the agreement is you cannot protest a task order.
Sir?
My initial question, John, you were going to made the statement that you said, make sure you have your funding sources documented for your IP. If you're a usual garage developer, how do you do that?
Well, okay. If you're a garage developer, you will have, at the time you submit your response to some RFP, you'll have a work product or something you're working from. Let's assume you do. Okay? So you take a copy of that and you put it on a CD, on a disc, and it's a hard copy, and it goes in the vault. Okay. All right? And then you say, okay, now I've got my federal money, because the decision about whether something is federally funded or privately funded or mixed funding is not done at the level of the total final deliverable. It's done at the level of the components that, sort of at the lowest levels of the components, a functional component. Okay? So you can have some components that are privately developed and some that are done with the federal funds. And you just have to be clear that you're only making, when you submit your offer, you say, I've done the work on A, B, C, and D. And I'm going to do, that's done, private, restricted rights. And I'm going to develop, using your money, government, G, H, and I.
Okay, so what you're saying is the thing that you bought is the way you create the delta assessment as far as what was funded with government money as opposed to what you brought to
Did you have a?
I would almost also suggest if you think of it as an IP right versus a patent, and if you have the initial idea and you establish that idea, you might not have all the code and the components written, but you have the idea. So you might keep it as a trade secret and you're not going to seek a patent on it, but you might want to document it like a patent so then you can say this was first invented prior to submitting it to the government. And then
The step up from what you said, Jonathan, a patent would actually be that vaulted version of that development.
Right. Well, in the sense that if you file a provisional application, for example, it is, I mean, as I said, you have to keep two things distinct in the federal government: data rights and patents. Okay. So yes, you can patent certain items. You can patent technique, an utility patent. You can file a provisional, and that will set that aside. But data rights is, you can have data rights and software that don't involve a patentable invention. So but it can still be something you privately developed, and therefore the government doesn't get unlimited rights to it. They still have to license it from you like anybody else would. All you've done is document the fact that that's where you were before you took the federal point. Right.
Before you formalized a contract, did you ever consider doing a regional agreement with a VISN to try and build a story to then take to a contracting level?
we actually generated this contract through the VA Center of Innovations. So they put out a open call saying, if you have an idea to make our system better, please bring it to us. And we actually had meetings with the local San Diego hospital in regards to mental health and saying, this is what we have that we feel that could be better. And they showed us a paper form, and we're like, we can not only just do the paper form, but we can actually make these decisions and send it to the VISTA system, CPRS, for your use. So, and I think it's always, I think, again, I'm not the certified expert on VA contracting, but I think it's better when you're responding to an RFP. The likelihood, and even with the support that we have, that you're going to get people to carry the water up the hill when there isn't funding available is a very daunting task, to ask somebody within a local hospital to do for you. So it's all, they were actually very grateful to us to say, here is the budget, here's the procurement, this is how we can fund this program. Because at the end of the day, that's really, somebody has to fund it, and the local hospitals I know have very, very little latitude on how their dollars are spent.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
With regard to the Buy America and Trade Agreements Act, or any other policy that might be familiar with, does that apply only for made in the USA or for U.S. companies that maybe have to be made overseas and also is that for purchasing only, or would that also apply for leasing equipment?
It applies to products that are purchased by the government, regardless of where the contractor is located. Okay. Whether it applies to leased products depends upon whether it's a genuine lease or it's a lease to buy kind of arrangement. If it's a genuine lease where there's still significant useful life left in the product after the end of the lease, then it doesn't. But if it's a long-term lease so that the product has no useful life at the term of the lease, then it does. If it's a functional equivalent of a purchase. Okay. All right, anybody else? Well, we thank you all very much for coming to this and to the previous 5 for those of you that have been here. I don't know, Justin said he had like a deal.
Swags in the back.
Swags in the back. Thank you very much for coming. We hope it's been useful. And Mike, thank you very much for sharing your.